Galactic had fought the Roxy swarm in the sulfur storms of Glyphon, held the line against void beasts in the Ort Cradle, survived the neural siege of the Veloc, and the orbital glassing of Sarin Prime. And still none of those infamous campaigns, stirred the memories, the fear, the silent weight that clung to him like the remnants of ash. The way humanity did, for they were not like the others. They were not governed by logic or driven by conquest. They did not obey patterns, they shattered them. They broke rules not to defy, but because they never agreed to them in the first place. And when they fought, it was not a calculated act. It was a release of something raw and ancient, something buried deep within them, like a dormant volcano that had waited 1,000 generations to awaken. He remembered the first moment he saw them, not in battle, but on a screen. A scouting drone had transmitted images from an outlying human settlement, a crude place by galactic standards, with structures made from local stone and wood fires burning in metal drums, and music, yes, music echoing through the streets, while a storm howled above. The humans laughed as lightning flashed across the sky. Children danced in the rain, bare feet slapping against wet concrete. Faces turned upward, fearless and unbothered by the violent chaos around them. They looked like prey, they looked soft, but Galactic felt a strange pressure in his chest, watching them, something ancient and long suppressed, a fear that evolution had almost erased. The High Command dismissed the footage irrelevant. They said primitive and harmless, they believed, but Galactic had seen enough predators in his lifetime to know when something was not afraid, and that alone made it dangerous. And so when the order came to begin the campaign, he did not protest. He simply reinforced his armor, ordered his elite unit to prepare, and warned them quietly that they would be facing something new, something unpredictable, something that might not even understand the concept of surrender. The drop onto Earth was unopposed at first. Wide fields, forests, and shattered cities welcomed them like open arms, but no resistance came out at first, not until they entered the human ruins, where messages were scrawled across walls in ink blood, and digital-like messages like "Do not mourn us, make them pay," and "We have already died, once this is the afterlife." And still High Command called it psychological warfare, but Galactic knew better. He had seen fear before. This was not fear, this was something else, something far more dangerous than fear. The first engagement took place near a human power facility. His squad advanced under cloaking screens, their exosuits optimized for urban warfare. They were ghosts among shadows. But the humans were waiting with homemade explosives, primitive railguns, and repurposed mining drones, and they fought with the kind of desperation that ignored pain, that welcomed death, that treated war not as a profession, but as a birthright. Galactic lost half his unit in 9 minutes against what should have been a defeated and fractured species, and as he lay in cover, with plasma burns on his arm, watching a wounded human crawl toward a detonator with a grin on her face, he realized something chilling. The humans were not fighting for survival, they were fighting for vengeance. And that was far worse. He stood before the tribunal of the 13th Accord, ancient minds, pulsing within crystalline thrones, their thoughts linked in a silent lattice of judgment and tradition. The chamber was carved into the heart of a dying star, bathed in golden light that shimmered with the weight of memory, and Galactic stood alone beneath it. His armor scorched, his left eye dimmed from a plasma burn, his voice raw, not from battle, but from the words he had prepared, the words that would change how the galaxy saw the humans if they chose to listen. He began without ceremony, without the ritualistic preamble. The tribunal favored his voice, cutting through the silence like a blade. We came to Earth under the banner of the Accord. We believed we were bringing order to a feral world, one riddled with chaos and division. We believed what we were told, that they were scattered tribes wielding ancient tools, dreaming ancient dreams, and dying ancient deaths. But we were wrong, so deeply wrong that the truth shattered everything I once believed about war, about purpose, about ourselves. The footage he showed next flickered through the chamber without sound. By their law, only the spoken word could guide a trial, but still the images said more than any declaration. Human defenders crouched behind rusted vehicles, firing into the night, their faces smeared with blood and dirt, some wearing pieces of enemy armor, others fighting with tools repurposed from their own dead. They moved with no pattern, no formation, just pure intent. One flowed into another like limbs of the same creature, and when one fell, another rose from behind, with no pause, no cry, no mourning, only fire. "They do not fight for territory," he said, and the elder minds stirred in confusion. "They do not fight for resources, they do not fight for supremacy or revenge. Though they are capable of all these things, know what drives them is older and darker and more complex than anything we have faced. Before they fight for ideas, they fight for the ghosts of ancestors who never knew peace. They fight because they believe no one else will." He showed a sequence from the Battle of Ganymede Ridge, a doomed skirmish. By all strategic accounts, the human forces were outnumbered 12 to 1. And yet they held the ridge for 13 hours using terrain and traps, and sheer audacity to keep the Accord forces at bay. And when the orbital strike was finally called, and the last transmission from the human commander was not a plea, but a whisper, "Tell my sister I made them earn it," and the screen cut to white as the fire swallowed them. Galactic turned to the tribunal and continued, "They do not measure victory by survival, they measure it by memory. Every loss becomes a legend, every sacrifice becomes a standard. Their children are raised on stories of defiance, and their artists carve their resistance into stone, metal, and bone. They turn pain into fuel and loss into fury, and when they sing, it is not to celebrate, but to remember and to warn. They are not a species you defeat by force," he said, "they are a species you bury, and still they reach back through the dirt and pull you in. They learned our language in days, not through sanctioned translation matrices or diplomatic channels, but by tearing apart our captured drones, by mimicking the sounds through broken speakers and coded light signals, by watching our lips and studying the patterns like predators learning a new scent. They hacked our drones in hours, converting scout units into saboteurs, rewriting directives so subtly that we only discovered the breach when our own machines turned against us in the middle of a recon sweep over the ashes of the city once called Kyoto. Their ingenuity was not polished, not refined. It was raw, brutal improvisation, born not from academia, but from necessity, and that made it terrifying to behold. Their weapons were not elegant, nor powered by clean energy cores. They used combustion heat, chemical force, and pressure systems that should have been obsolete millennia ago, yet they worked with horrifying efficiency, tearing through shields with kinetic force our engineers never thought to defend against. When we tried to disrupt their networks, they built new ones out of salvaged parts. They routed communications through abandoned satellites and weather stations, and even encoded messages into the light flickers of burning buildings. A squad once tracked what we thought was random flickering only to decode an ambush plan buried in the flame itself. They had turned chaos into language and destruction into direction. Their command structure, if it could even be called that, was a swirling, decentralized storm leaders, changed by the hour based on who was standing, who had the clearest shot, who still had breath in their lungs. They moved like a swarm with shared purpose, but no central node, making it impossible to cripple their coordination, because there was no coordination to destroy, just willpower distributed across thousands of minds who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. Our greatest tacticians tried to map their behavior, build predictive models, simulate responses, but every algorithm failed. They adapted faster than our systems could calculate, and when we tried to outthink them, they simply stopped thinking at all and started doing. And when we tried to bait them with false retreats, they laid traps of their own, using their own wounded as lures and their own dead as barriers. Their ruthlessness was matched only by their creativity, and both were endless. A report from one of our forward commanders detailed a human who had severed his own arm to free himself from wreckage, then used a shard of his own bone to stab one of our soldiers through the neck. Such stories were not isolated. They were patterns, they were lessons, and every one of them forced our troops to fight not only a physical enemy, but the creeping horror that we had awakened something buried in their blood. We began to see them in our dreams, faceless humans rising from rubble, eyes glowing with fire that had no source, speaking in voices that shook the air with a message we began to believe was meant not for us, but for something older, something watching. And when we listened closely, the voice said only this: we are still here. In one village nestled between the ruins of their ancient cities, our scouts moved quietly under the cover of dusk, their silhouettes barely shadows, as they crept through alleys lined with crumbled stone and shattered glass. Their scanner showed no heat, no movement, no sign of life, and yet something felt wrong, the kind of wrong that makes silence feel like a scream held just beneath the surface. They entered a building once a school, its walls scorched by orbital fire, its roof half caved in. And there in the main hall, they found the bodies arranged carefully with purpose, not random, not panicked, but deliberate, faces peaceful, hands crossed on chests, eyes closed, not a single weapon drawn among them. And yet the message carved into the floor in blood read, "We do not die for fear, we die for each other." The detonator was hidden beneath the smallest body, no more than 8 of their years. The explosion vaporized 4 of my soldiers. In an instant, the shockwave tearing through our armor like paper, and as the dust cleared, what remained was not rage, it was understanding. Something cold and heavy sank into my chest as I realized they had planned it days, maybe weeks in advance, knowing we would come and knowing they would not survive, and still choosing to stay. Their courage was not loud, it did not boast or roar, it was the quiet, unshakable kind that refuses to move even as the fire closes in. They turned their dead into strategy, their grief into tactics, and their funerals into traps. And the worst part, the truly horrifying part, was that it worked not because of technology, not because of strength, but because we were not prepared to fight people who had already accepted death as the cost of freedom. Later that same week, we found one of our prisoners, a captured sergeant, held in a makeshift cell fashioned from broken transport parts and reinforced with rebar. He had been wounded, bleeding, infected, and yet he lived. They had treated his injuries, fed him, allowed him to speak. And when we asked why, the human commander said, "Because he has a mother, and I would not want her to suffer the way ours have." They mourned their enemies even as they killed them. They buried our dead alongside their own. When time allowed, they memorized the names of our fallen and whispered them at night, and I began to suspect that this was not kindness, but defiance, for in remembering even their enemies, they denied us the power to dehumanize them. They made war personal, and once war becomes personal, it becomes impossible to win without losing part of yourself. I once believed sacrifice was a strategic resource, something measured and spent like ammunition, but the humans had made it into an art form, a ritual, a weapon forged in story and fire and blood. They wore their losses like armor, and with every friend they buried, they grew sharper, meaner, harder to predict. It was not sorrow that followed their defeats, it was resolve. And it was endless. We tried negotiation, we offered them terms that would have made lesser species kneel, we promised reconstruction resources, peace. They responded with silence, and then with sabotage, and then with fire. They did not want compromise, they did not want our systems or our guidance, they wanted us gone. And they were willing to tear down the sky to make that happen. We sent threats, we broadcast ultimatums, we unleashed weapons banned by 9 galactic accords, but none of it slowed them. If anything, it only made them fight harder, more focused, more vicious. They did not retreat. When we escalated, they adapted. When we scorched their cities, they learned to fight underground. When we jammed their signals, they used birds and mirrors and relays built from household scraps. When we blocked their airspace, they launched balloons painted with thermal signatures to confuse our targeting systems. And when we finally landed in force, thinking to crush them quickly, they lured us into their forests, where the trees were wired with explosives, and the rivers were filled with acid traps, and the children watched from the shadows, not with fear, but with quiet fury. They fed on adversity, they drank it like water. They turned pain into something we could not match, something we could not predict. They carved our insignias into the sides of their bunkers, not in tribute, but in mockery. And every time we pushed, they pulled us into terrain that twisted our tech into useless metal and forced our soldiers to fight on terms we did not understand. They'd fought with rage, but it was not mindless, it was focused like a scalpel, not a hammer. When we struck their power grids, they struck our medics. When we bombed their fields, they infected our supply lines with viral code. When we destroyed their archives, they found ours and used the data against us. They learned everything and forgot nothing, and they did it without mercy or hesitation. I saw one of them lead a charge through a chemical firestorm, carrying nothing but a railgun welded from 2 broken rifle stocks, screaming names I did not recognize, and when the flames took him, he crawled forward, still aiming, still firing, until his weapon melted in his hands. We scanned his body later and found no drugs, no enhancements, nothing but raw will and fractured bones. They built machines that should not have worked, war mechs held together by chains, and Fury drones made from repurposed farming bots and batteries. Stolen from crashed transports, they flew aircraft that ran on cooking oil and liquid fear, and they guided them with hand signals and hope. And still they flew, still they struck, still they returned, sometimes without wings or engines, but they returned. We believed morale was a finite resource, that spirit could be crushed under pressure, but they proved us wrong over and over again. Their morale was not a meter to be drained, it was a flame to be fed, and we were the fuel, and every mistake we made only made them stronger, only made them fight longer. And I began to understand that they did not fear extinction, they had made peace with it long ago, and that made them impossible to defeat. I watched as our generals fell one by one, not on the battlefield, but in the command halls, where strategy collapsed under the weight of unpredictability, and where confidence was replaced by quiet dread. Every attempt to outmaneuver them ended in loss, every prediction failed as if the humans could smell intention itself, and twisted into failure before the order was ever spoken. They outflanked our logic, outpaced our tech, and outlasted our patience, until the war no longer followed the rules we had written, but the chaos they had mastered. They did not win by strength, they won by endurance, by creativity, by refusing to break. Where we would have shattered, they turned starvation into strategy, using ration packs as bait and capturing supply lines. With nothing but slings and wires, they carried wounded soldiers into fire to retrieve ammunition, and carried fallen enemies into their camps to study their armor, their weapons, their weaknesses, and in time they used that knowledge against us with terrifying precision. On the planet they called Alphen Ridge, we deployed an elite force supported by orbital scans, armored carriers, and neural tacticians, and still we were driven back not by tanks or airstrikes, but by humans in scavenged gear using terrain we could barely walk through. They collapsed cliffs and triggered avalanches. They rerouted steam vents into our camps. They launched spikes dipped in corrosive acids at our vehicles, and when we finally began to gain ground, they disappeared into the mist and let the planet itself take us. At the edge of the final gorge, I saw a boy no older than 12 carrying a man twice his size across terrain. So rough our exosuits struggled to maintain balance. The man was bleeding, the boy was limping, and yet they moved without hesitation, driven by something invisible and unshakable. When our marksman hesitated to fire, I did not question it, because in that moment I knew that even if he struck them down, 100 more would rise in their place with the same look in their eyes. They built shrines where we fell, not to honor us, but to remind themselves of the cost, and every shrine became a rally point, every crater a story, every scar on the land a lesson passed from one fighter to another, until it was no longer a war between fleets, but a war between memory and silence never stood a chance. They sang over the dead not with sorrow, but with steel in their voices and fire in their words. They stitched flags from the uniforms of the fallen and turned them into banners that hung from broken towers. And even when we brought the towers down, the banners flew again within days, as if defiance itself was woven into the threads. And so I understood something that would haunt me forever, that we had not invaded a species, we had disturbed a graveyard and called it conquest. We had not declared war, we had awakened it, and humanity did not respond with resistance, they responded with remembrance. And through remembrance, they became something far more dangerous than soldiers. They became the storm. Now, I stand here in front of you all not to plead, not to beg for mercy, but to warn you all of what humanity has become, what they are capable of, and what they will do if we ever again find ourselves across from them on the battlefield. For you cannot defeat them, you cannot break them, you cannot even understand them, because they are not like us. They do not view war as we do. They do not see death the way we see it. They do not see victory the way we do. They are not bound by the same laws of engagement or strategy. They do not fight to gain, they fight to survive. They fight because it is the only thing they know to do when faced with the kind of existential nightmare that we brought to their doorsteps when we broke their world. They did not weep, they did not plead, they fought back with a will forged in the furnace of their own destruction, and that will cannot be crushed by anything short of the complete annihilation of every last one of them. And even then they will not die, they will live in memory, they will live in stories, they will live in every whisper of rebellion that comes after, and that is the most terrifying thing of all. They have no concept of surrender, they have no understanding of what it means to admit defeat, they do not understand the meaning of capitulation. Because they do not care about winning as much as they care about fighting, they will fight to the last breath, to the last bullet, to the last ember of their bodies if necessary. And they will do it not for glory or power, but for each other, for the idea that they will not be erased, not from this world, not from the history books, not from the stars above. And when we see that, we see the edge of something far darker than we are capable of understanding. We thought we could subjugate them, we thought we could use their weaknesses against them. But their weakness was never weakness, their greatest strength was in their defiance, and in their ability to carry that defiance across generations. They do not inherit our customs, our cultures, or our beliefs. They inherit the one truth that binds them together. No matter what happens, no matter how hard the world presses upon them, they will not bend, they will not break, they will not fall. When I look at them now, I see not a defeated species, not a broken race, but something far more dangerous. I see a force of nature. I see an unstoppable wave of fire that cannot be quenched. And as they rebuild, as they always rebuild after every defeat, after every sacrifice, I realize that we cannot destroy them. We can only delay them. We can only delay the moment when they rise again, stronger than ever, more united than ever, with the same fierce fire that brought them to this moment. And in that fire, in that undying resolve, I see the future. I see the one thing that cannot be taken from them, not by us, not by any power in this galaxy. They are not afraid of death, for they have already stared it in the face and walked away alive. And that is the truth I bring before you today. The humanity is not just another species. It is a force that cannot be contained.